Hello everyone, welcome back to the Doctrine, Dogma, and Davide podcast. My name is Davide, and today I want to talk about 3 things I love about the traditional Latin Mass. Now, as I've stated in several videos in the past, I prefer the traditional Latin Mass. That is the Mass that I go to whenever I can, and so I just want to share 3 reasons that I love and appreciate the traditional Latin Mass so much, and explain a little bit of why I prefer that form of the liturgy. Now, the first reason I have for preferring the traditional Latin Mass is the fact that it is celebrated universally in Latin. Now, the reason that that is so precious to me is, one, there's definitely something precious about celebrating the Mass in the tongue of your mother church. I am a Roman Catholic. I am a part of the Latin Rite. And as such, Latin is the mother tongue of my church. And just as I don't think that it would be good for, say, the Greek Catholic Church to purge the Greek language from their liturgies, I don't think that it's a good thing for the Latin Church to purge Latin from our liturgies. I think that the loss of sort of the tongue of our mother church is, a little bit sad, because it's a loss of sort of the connection we have to our ancient church. And I think that it's a little bit lamentable that we've sort of lost a lot of that connection. And the other thing that I really appreciate about the Latin liturgy is the fact that it is the same no matter where you go in the world. I really love how when the Mass is celebrated in Latin, you can go anywhere in the world. You can be in Rome, you can be in South America, you can be in Germany, and you can still actively and fully participate in the Mass because we are all speaking the language of the Church. We're all speaking Latin. Recently, I was speaking to a friend of mine who works in the chancery of my diocese, and he pointed out the fact that at this past World Youth Day, the Mass was celebrated in Portuguese. And so most of the people there who didn't speak Portuguese couldn't actually respond at Mass, couldn't actually fully participate at the Mass because they didn't speak the language. Whereas if the Latin had been preserved, as the Second Vatican Council said that it should be, then everyone would have known Latin and would have been able to participate in a Latin Mass at World Youth Day. Very similarly to how when I attended the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI, and the responses were done in Latin, all of us who were at Benedict's funeral, even though we came from all around the world and all spoke different languages, we were all able to respond at the Mass in Latin, in unison. And there was such a wonderful feeling of unity in the fact that even though we couldn't speak to each other, we could all praise and worship God in the same language and in community with each other, despite our division of languages. Now, the second reason that I love the traditional Latin Mass is its reverence. Now, this is something you'll hear pretty much everyone who loves the traditional Latin Mass will cite its reverence. And, a response that a lot of people will make, including sometimes myself, I will respond this way as well, is people will say, well, the Novus Ordo can be celebrated reverently too. And that's absolutely true. I grew up with a very reverent Novus Ordo. In fact, the Novus Ordo that I grew up with, was celebrated in Latin. And so the Novus Ordo can absolutely be celebrated very reverently. But the critique that I and others will make of the Novus Ordo Mass is that the rubrics of the Novus Ordo Mass leave a lot more room for experimentation, for interpretation, for variations according to the preference of the celebrant. And so essentially what you end up with is a situation where the rubrics make reverence at the Novus Ordo optional, whereas the rubrics of the traditional Latin Mass are so strict and so rigid that they essentially make reverence pretty much mandatory. And there are several other things that sort of enhance the reverence of the traditional Latin Mass that are mandated in the 1962 Missal that are not required in the Novus Ordo Missal. Things like ad orientem worship, where the priest faces towards the orient or towards the east. Basically, it's when the priest is facing towards the tabernacle rather than facing towards the people. Things like kneeling for communion. And again, these are all things that are permitted in the Novus Ordo. And again, the Mass that I grew up with, these things were also practiced at the Novus Ordo. But I really appreciate that at the traditional Latin Mass, when I go to Mass according to the 1962 Missal, I don't have to wonder about whether or not people will kneel for the Most Holy Eucharist. I don't have to wonder about whether or not the priest will be facing towards the tabernacle or towards me. And so because these things are required in the traditional Latin Mass, it results in a much more consistently reverent Mass. Mass that I can confidently go to. Now, the third thing that I really appreciate about the traditional Latin Mass is, again, something that you might not have necessarily noticed and is really just a very small thing. But I love the fact that when you receive communion at the traditional Latin Mass, the priest gives like a small personal benediction with the Most Holy Eucharist. He makes the sign of the cross before distributing the Eucharist to each communicant. And I think that that's really beautiful. I really appreciate that individual benediction of, like, seeing my Savior, looking him in the eye, and adoring him before then receiving him into my body. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing that I just love so much. But those are the three things that I personally love the most about the traditional Latin Mass. If you have additional things that you think I missed that you think are also wonderful about the traditional Latin Mass, go ahead and leave those in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was spiritually fruitful for you. If it was, be sure to like, comment, do whatever it is that people of the internet do, and I will see you all next week. God bless you.